Westfield, Massachusetts. A Tuesday like any other. It's the kind of town where neighbors know each other by name, and the police force isn't just law enforcement, it's part of the community itself. At 11:47 in the morning, Detective Brian Fanion clocks out of the Westfield Police Department for his lunch break. It's a routine he's followed for years. Nothing about this moment suggests it will be remembered. Less than an hour later, he is on the phone with 911, not about a case, not about a suspect, about his own wife. Just after noon, on May 8, 2018, Brian Fanion tells the dispatcher that his wife, Amy Fanion, has shot herself in the head. Before she was a name in a homicide file, Amy Fanion was simply Amy Hansen, one of 10 children growing up in Westfield, 6 girls and 4 boys, raised in a house that was never quiet for long. She married Brian Fanion, and together they built what looked, from the outside, like exactly the kind of life people hope for. More than 30 years of marriage, active members of their church. Amy, a devoted stay-at-home mother, who made the Fanion household run. Those who knew her best didn't hesitate when asked to describe her. Prosecutors would later call her giving, selfless, completely devoted to her family. The kind of person who seemed almost too good to be real. On the night before she died, Amy wasn't worrying about her marriage, or her safety, or her future. She was wrapping a gift for an upcoming baby shower, texting back and forth with her daughter Victoria about small, ordinary things. By every account from the people who loved her, Amy was healthy. She wasn't grieving. She wasn't desperate. She was not, by any measure, a woman preparing to end her own life. She was a mother thinking about a baby shower gift. Less than 24 hours later, she would be found dead on her own dining room floor. In Westfield, the Fanion name meant something. For generations, Brian's family had served this community, in the police department, in local politics, so much so that one true crime program would later call them the Kennedys of Westfield. Brian carried that legacy. A respected detective, a deacon at his church. On paper, he was everything a Fanion was supposed to be, but prosecutors would later argue that underneath that image, something else was forming. Brian, they claimed, was having an affair, and he did not want to give up half of his pension in a divorce. Investigators discovered that Brian had used his own work computer at the Westfield Police Department to look into exactly how a divorce would affect that pension. To prosecutors, this wasn't a man simply unhappy in his marriage. This was a man calculating the cost of leaving it. A man who, they argued, couldn't face what divorce would do to his name, to his family's reputation, to his standing in a town where everyone knew the Fanions. Divorce, after all, is public, and in Westfield, what people thought of you mattered more than almost anything else. What no one outside that marriage understood yet was just how far Brian Fanion may have been willing to go to make sure no one ever found out the truth. Brian Fanion was nearing retirement from the Westfield Police Department, and according to his own account, that single decision became the flashpoint of his marriage. The defense would later tell a story rooted in an ordinary domestic dispute. On the day Amy died, they claimed, an argument broke out over Brian's retirement plans and over his refusal to attend a play that a family member was performing in. A disagreement, they argued. Nothing more. The prosecution told a different story entirely. To them, this wasn't about a single argument at all. It was about a marriage already strained for months, an affair Brian was allegedly having, a pension he didn't want to split, and a divorce he felt he couldn't survive in a town where his family's name still meant something. Two competing versions of the same morning. One man, the same house, the same gunshot, but two entirely different explanations for how it happened. Which one was the truth? That question is exactly what a Hamden Superior Court jury would eventually be asked to answer. 11 days before Amy Fanion died, between 9:22 and 9:38 in the morning, Brian sat down at a computer and visited 5 different web pages about gunshot residue. One was an article titled, "Gunshot Residue Collection: The Decisions That Make or Break a Case." Another was a YouTube video called, "What Gunshot Residue Tests Tell Us." At the time, Brian wasn't assigned to a single active case that would have required any of that information. There was no investigation tied to his job that explains it. Just a detective, alone with a search bar, reading about exactly the kind of forensic evidence that gunshot residue testing produces, or fails to produce. What it looked like. Routine browsing, nothing more. What the evidence would later show, a man researching the very detail that could expose, or conceal, how a gunshot death actually happened. One day before Amy died, on May 7th, Brian repeatedly searched his own phone for how to delete his list of frequent contacts. His defense would later offer a simple explanation. He was switching to a new phone and clearing out old data. Prosecutors would frame it differently. A man quietly erasing a digital trail the day before his wife's death. Then came May 8, 2018. By every appearance, it was an unremarkable morning. Brian went to work at the Westfield Police Department like he had thousands of times before. Nothing about him, by any account, gave away what was coming. At 11:47 a.m., he left for lunch. What it looked like, a routine break in an ordinary workday. What prosecutors would argue, by the moment he walked out that door, Brian Fanion already knew exactly what he intended to do. Less than 15 minutes later, inside his own home, a gunshot rang out. Just after noon, Brian called 911. He told the dispatcher that he and Amy had been arguing about his retirement, and that in the middle of that argument, Amy had picked up his service weapon, the same handgun issued to him by the Westfield Police Department, and shot herself in the head. That was Brian's account. But within hours, at that same dining room table, investigators would begin gathering evidence that told an entirely different story. When Massachusetts State Police arrived at the Fanion home, they walked into what had been called in as a suicide. Instead, they found Amy Fanion on the dining room floor, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. Two details caught their attention almost immediately. The first, the gun lying near her body wasn't just any weapon. It was Brian's own department-issued service pistol, the same firearm the Westfield Police Department had entrusted to him for his work as a detective. The second, there was an unusual lack of gunshot residue on Amy's head. In a typical self-inflicted gunshot wound at close range, residue is expected. Here, it was largely absent, a detail that didn't match the story investigators were being told. Brian was taken from the scene by Detective Brendan O'Toole, driven to the State Police Barracks in Russell, Massachusetts, to give his official statement. For a town like Westfield, this wasn't an abstract case on the news. This was a man people had trusted for years, a detective who had worn the badge, who had stood at the front of his church as a deacon, who had been counted on, again and again, to protect the very community now being asked to imagine him standing over his wife's body. As the investigation unfolded, the evidence began to form a pattern, and that pattern kept pointing away from suicide. The first piece was forensic. The lack of gunshot residue on Amy's head simply didn't fit a self-inflicted wound. In cases of suicide by gunshot at close range, residue is the expected signature. Here, it was missing, a gap between what the scene was supposed to show and what it actually showed. The second piece came from the toxicology report. When the results came back, they showed no substances at all in Amy's system, no medication, no alcohol. Nothing that could point to an altered or impulsive state of mind. Whatever happened in that dining room, it wasn't the act of someone chemically pushed to the edge. The third piece was digital, and this is where the timeline started connecting. The gunshot residue searches from 11 days earlier. The research into how a divorce would affect Brian's pension. The contact deletion searches the day before Amy died. On their own, each search might mean nothing. Together, prosecutors argued, they formed a trail, not of panic, but of planning. And then came the piece that made this case genuinely strange. Several members of Amy's own family were called to the stand, not by the defense, but by the prosecution. And yet, when they testified, their words actually supported Brian's version of events. Many of them had signed a letter stating, on record, that they believed Amy had taken her own life. A family torn apart, standing publicly behind the man accused of killing their sister, their daughter, their aunt. But not all of them. Anna Hansen, Amy's younger sister, was the very first witness the prosecution called to the stand. A signal that inside that same family, not everyone agreed on what had happened in that house. Why would half of Amy's own family believe Brian, and why didn't the other half? That question would hang over the rest of the trial. By this point in the trial, Brian Fanion's defense had a serious problem. Prosecutors argued, point by point, that his account of what happened in that dining room simply didn't line up with the physical evidence at the scene, the missing residue, the toxicology, the searches. Piece by piece, his version of events was being measured against the facts, and coming up short. So the defense shifted strategy. If the evidence couldn't be explained away, perhaps Amy herself could be reframed instead. Brian's attorney argued that Amy had anger issues, that she suffered from anxiety, and that in the days before her death, people close to her had to tread carefully, his words, to avoid setting her off. It was no longer just a question of what happened on May 8th. It had become a question of who Amy Fanion really was, argued in open court. in front of her own family, years after she could no longer speak for herself. And in that courtroom, two narratives were now colliding directly. On one side, a grieving family, some of them still standing by Brian, insisting the woman they knew would never have been murdered, that she had simply taken her own life. On the other, a prosecution laying out, methodically, fact by fact, a case for calculated, premeditated murder. Both could not be true. And the jury in that Hampden County courtroom was the only group left who would decide which one was. On February 23, 2023, Brian Fanion's trial began in earnest. What would become, by every measure, the most publicized case Westfield had ever seen. Reporters filled the courtroom. Cameras lined the hallway outside. A town that had spent generations watching the Fanion name attached to public service was now watching it attached to a murder trial. The prosecution's closing argument was direct. They asked the jury to find Brian Fanion guilty of first-degree murder, to look at the residue, the toxicology, the searches, the timeline, and recognize all of it for exactly what they believed it was: evidence of a calculated killing. The defense closed just as directly, asking the jury to find Brian not guilty, to believe that Amy, in a moment of anger and anxiety, had taken her own life. The jury deliberated, and on March 22, 2023, the verdict came back. A Hampton Superior Court jury found Brian Fanion guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced that same day to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Outside the courtroom, Hampden District Attorney Anthony Gallooni didn't soften his words. Mr. Fanion's behavior, he said, was calculating and shockingly cruel. Brian's defense attorney, Jeffrey Brown, saw it differently to the very end. Your Honor, he told the court, the jury plainly got it wrong. Two statements, two completely different versions of the same man, but only one of them would carry the weight of the law. In the end, this story isn't really about Brian Fanion. It's about Amy. The same woman who, on the last night of her life, wasn't worried about her marriage or her safety. She was wrapping a gift for a baby shower. She was texting her daughter Victoria about small, ordinary things, the kind of things mothers and daughters talk about on any given night. She had no idea it was the last night. What this case leaves behind is bigger than one verdict. It's a reminder of how much weight reputation can carry in a small community, how the fear of public judgment, of losing a name that's meant something for generations, can drive a person toward decisions that protect an image instead of a marriage, a family, a life. And it leaves behind a wound inside Amy's own family that may never fully close. Relatives who stood by Brian until the very end, and others, like her sister Anna, who stood for Amy instead. That division didn't end when the verdict came in. For some of them, it likely never will. Amy Fanion spent her life giving to everyone around her. In the end, it was her own family and her own community left to decide who to believe, and a jury that finally gave her the truth she never got to speak for herself.